So welcome to Sociology of the Family. I am Dr. Beverly Ann Thompson,
And I'm Akello Stone,
and I'm a professor over here in Albany, New York.
and I'm an adjunct sociology professor in Los Angeles, California.
And we both teach Sociology of the Family, so we're both looking over the family textbook. And today we're looking at chapter 11, which talks about work and families.
As a sociologist, I'm really interested in how this remote work is going to ultimately change, what work means for the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our current pandemic situation could relate to this by who gets to work from home, who has to go and be considered essential worker. And then, children are at home doing schoolwork. So who has to help the children and kind of get in the way of their own work?
Yeah, what's really interesting to me is there are many fathers, if you have two working parents, or even just the father, like the father working from home and the children being at home and the domestic necessities that need to be tended to at home, and how is that now playing out?
Yeah. And whose work is more interruptible than permissible?
Yes. Yeah, and I think we know the answer to that question.
It reminds me, did you see that viral video of the child busting in on the father who was conducting a news interview? And
No.
the mom chases in the room after him. And he's a white man in a suit, very formal background. Uh,
Yeah.
and then the wife is an Asian woman, and she runs into the room after this toddler who's 2 years old, who dances into the room. And then it became a viral video, and everyone assumed that mother was the maid because she's an Asian
Oh,
woman.
wow. Instead, he's just reaffirming those gender roles which have persisted, since the beginning of time, at least in my mind, and continue to persist.
Right. In the first part of the chapter, the introduction, they start defining some of the key terms. And so, of course, the first one is work. What is work? And it's really based on the market economy. Work is exchange of labor for money, for material resources. And then care work is the work performed face to face to care for another human, a child, an adult. And then housework, which is the cooking and cleaning of the house, the yard work, and so on. And so these are the main themes and categories that we look at in this chapter, especially thinking about families and different types of families and how they split this work up, and how social forces help make that decision, guide that decision, shall we say.
And the other thing, too, that's interesting is within this system of work, there are individuals that make certain decisions. That's one point of interest. And also the way in which paid work, like market work, can offset care work and housework if you have the budget and you make those decisions to, pay for someone else to do that. But then on the same aspect, the person that's doing that paid work is underpaid, is usually a woman. And so that's contributing to the struggles that she has in her family. The graph on page 402 that shows the actual overlap of these three kinds of work is very illuminating, because as you can see, paid work is just a small percentage of the intersection of these three types of work.
And then we see also that, of course, paid work, and since we live in a capitalist society where all our values are really tied into the dollar sign, paid work is more valued. Obviously, it's paid over unpaid work. And so I just always found it interesting that, you hear in society people saying like, oh, raising children is the most important work there is, and it's so valuable.
Yeah.
Then when you look at how those care workers are treated, how they're paid, how they're viewed in society, it tells a different story.
But kind of fundamental to the conversation is, number one, being able to feed and care for your children. It is the most important work. And if you were to pay for someone else to do that, the market work for that could be extremely high.
So one of the most important overview topics in this chapter to consider is that men's position has remained relatively flat over time. It's around 85%, 80% employed. And over the last 100 years, it's pretty much remained right there. And even if you think about things like men's dress and their occupations and so on, I mean, these categories have remained relatively stable. But what's really been fundamentally and radically changed on this topic is women. Women enter into the workforce, the paid workforce, and into a workforce that was designed around this ideal male worker. And so that's where the conflict comes. And the conflict might not be as present for men, except that they do slightly more want to participate in their family life and so on. But as we'll see towards the end of the chapter, they talked about how a lot of men are pretty happy working full time, but it's women who prefer to work part time. So we can.
Well, and as far as labor force participation, there's definitely a relationship for women to their degree of education and whether or not they have children. And there's marked differences in that respect. And we know if there's no labor force participation as a result of raising children and as a result of an inability to find work that's going to support the family, poor women with children are still having the greatest struggle.
Right. It's interesting. The chapter really focused on, of course, this kind of heterosexual family model. We can really feel that kind of presence throughout, like a man and a woman with children. But they didn't so much, it seems, talk about like single women or, LGBT families or just alternative models of how that could really be a lot more enjoyable, perhaps, as far as the work-life balance, when you think about people without children.
Yeah, it is too. And the other thing too is I think we tend to, when we talk about LGBT families, we have to also keep in mind that men and women, regardless of their sexual orientation, are all socialized into gender roles. And number one, and number two, let's say you had a family where there were two women who both worked, and then you had a family where there were two men who both worked, which is quite possible. Men's earnings would obviously, the two male-headed households would be earning far more than the two female-headed households. What I would find interesting in that scenario, as a result, as it relates to gender socialization, is how housework is split up in same-sex couples.
And the chapter does allude to the guess that it's a lot more equitable in those types of relationships.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that is something that really does need to be looked at a little bit more closely, because when you have a heterosexual couple, there's still a tendency of, maintaining the gender segregated work in the home.
It reminded me of this article I used to assign called Plan B, where you have young couples who idealize their relationship being equal in the future when you ask them how they would split up work and raise their children. So you have young people with new, more equitable ideals, but when reality happens and you have the baby, then they just kind of revert back to these notions that are similar to their parents, or just similar to the larger cultural context of promoting male workers and female caretakers.
But there was a discussion of stay-at-home dads and what that means. What does it mean in terms of defining manhood? Even if a man wants to stay at home and take care of the children, there's a conflict there. There's a stigma of the stay-at-home dad. Other men will see him as deficient. He will be emasculated, and he'll be seen as lazy and unmotivated. You're just staying home taking care of kids, which ultimately devalues the unpaid work that women do if men start to do that. So it does illuminate that problem, doesn't it?
Right. And that gets to the section on occupational segregation, which just means that there it remains a persistency with men and women having
Mhm.
different types of jobs, and then within similar jobs, they might play different roles. Have different pieces of those jobs, and this comes to the key term that they list called the gender division of labor, just how we allocate work to men and women within our society. So we see here on page 406 in this chart at the top of the page where they list um, different kinds of professions related to care work, and how much, what percentage is female, and how much these professions get paid. And so we can see that they're paid very little.
They're paid very little, and it's just mind-boggling to see, the percentage of child care workers, and again, 94%, and how many men, even though they may want to, go into child development and work in that arena, like that's such a critical period in a child's life, but they will not do that because number one, they won't get paid enough to live on. And number two, men are very selective in the occupations they choose. And if there's a female dominated occupation, again, there is a threat to what they've defined their manhood to be, which is to be in an arena where there are more men than women.
Yeah, that points to this concept, I think it's called the glass escalator, where when men enter female-dominated professions, they shoot right to the top. So it's easy
Yes,
for a man
absolutely.
to become the manager of the child care center, or a head nurse or something like that.
Yeah. The other thing too that kind of was a repeated theme I found interesting in this chapter is all of these, sociological aspects of looking at work comes down to the concern of profit loss for private businesses and the relationship of government intervention and private companies, so that the government doesn't want to put too much pressure on private companies to be able to equalize the playing field, to be able to, offer compensation for time off, things like that, people need to work. They need to make money. But if you have to decide, if you're paying 90% of your meager salary on childcare, because that is a condition necessary for you to be able to work, that is so problematic,
Right.
and it still remains that way because we know that we are unwilling. At least I would admit, at a very early age, in seeing people with kids, I realized I was unwilling to. I was unwilling to do, to have children, not just because of the cost, right? The cost is a factor, but the immense responsibility of raising the children in this social context in the way that I would want to raise them, I didn't feel that it was possible. And so my thing is, if you can't do something to this degree that where you can't do it, then you probably have to make a different decision.
Those are important points, and it brings us to the next section, which talks about housework and childcare, and just this balance then with the market labor, and then and how do you even measure housework and childcare? And so sociologists use the time use study, which is basically people keeping a journal of how much time they spent with each activity.
And you know what? There's always problems in, what would you call it? Self-reporting.
Yeah.
Because for one thing, that adds just an extra burden to be able to do that calculation and do it accurately. And then could be an inherent desire to maybe change the numbers a little bit. So, like people, kind of the idea of, if I was walking through the house and I dusted the shelf and it was like 5 minutes, would I even count that,
Mhm.
into this time use? Because it's not like we're doing something for like an hour and then something for an hour. And sometimes you're doing something, at the same time. You could be cooking, talking on the phone, taking care of your children,
Right.
and, all at the same time. And so when we talk about time use, it's just an estimate.
This was an interesting figure, the figure 11.5, because they compare two different families and talk about how one family has the breadwinner homemaker model and the other family has a very egalitarian relationship where
Mhm.
they both work in the market and they both work in the house. And then ultimately the traditional family ended up with 7 extra hours of housework completed. And so it kind of implies that they're ahead of the game.
Well, and this is the other thing about this. The chart here is in the traditional household or the egalitarian household. Are they, in that example, to go deeper? Are they paying because they have income? Are they paying someone? Because there is a 7-hour difference in the number of unpaid work that's happening in the home. And I just don't think that it means that if two people work, then there's responsibilities at home are just, not taken care of. I think there would be a percentage of their income that would pay someone, probably underpay them, of course.
And of course, it's important to point out between these two families that in the egalitarian family, they both made $15 an hour, whereas in the traditional family model, that male salary jumped up to $30 an hour. So this
Yeah.
is implying a different socioeconomic
Yeah.
status of a family as well.
If I may move into the section on toward gender balance, what really struck me is that, and if we looked at that example that we just talked about, where the man made $30 and the woman did the unpaid work, there's a power differential that happens when one partner makes significantly more than the other. That plays out probably as like, I make more money than you. You should be doing, this housework
Right.
and not being paid for it.
I think this is an important point, and I discuss this with my students because it kind of makes sense. The man is making more money, so why don't you let him be the one to keep working and she stays at home? But as the section points out also, that's just a circular argument that reinforces itself, because had the woman been out in the marketplace and continued to grow her career, then she could be far, far further along with her career, but because she had to cut back and stay in the home, she disadvantaged herself professionally. And
Absolutely.
so the section
Yeah.
also implies that if the two should break up, that the man is going to have a much easier opportunity to replace the domestic work that his ex-wife conducted, whereas she has to go out and find herself a new breadwinning husband
Yeah,
or get
absolutely.
a job which she doesn't have the training to do because she was previously a homemaker.
And what I always, what I talk about with my students is asking them at what point in the coupling process, we'll call it dating, at what point in the dating, because it seems like dating in love marriages, right? Dating leads to marriage. So not necessarily, but no one just meets someone for the first time in a love marriage and marries them. So during this process of let's get to know one another, our core values, there's times when, having children may come up, but what's never really discussed are things like unpaid work in the home and, are there people, and let's be honest, I know some students, there are people who still believe that the gender segregated work is because of natural competency and the natural order of the universe, that women will be the primary caretaker of the children and the women will do the housework because they do it better. The idea that one gender does some, let's say, drudgery better than another, that's like, I always say this is what men usually have to commit to do is take out the trash and mow the lawn. They may even farm out the mowing of the lawn, but everything else in the home, and if you're, a single person like me, it's a lot of work.
So they have a section that talks about the division of labor within married couples, and they start their chart in 1965 and all the way up till 2015, and we
Mhm.
can just see a big shift in who does what within the house. And in a different section, they mentioned, that women were doing 7 or 8 times as much housework as the man, but now it's just 2 to 1, which sounds like a huge improvement, but it's still an inequality happening there. But women have done overall, the hours in the house have gone down for everyone. Women do a lot less, when men do a lot more. And so things have shifted towards equality, but we're not there yet.
Well, here's the thing that I find interesting about this infographic is it talks about the number of weekly hours, right? But I also look at the dates and the times and technological advancements, like things like dishwashers, let's say Roombas, or certain things that make it easier, but so that it takes less time, but it still has to be done, right? It might take less time to fill the dishwasher and have the dishwasher do the dishes, but it still has to be emptied and things still have to be put away. And while the number of hours may be smaller, the level of responsibility is still going to be predominantly in the hands of the woman in a household.
I was surprised by the chart on page 414 with the husband earns 50,000 or more than the wife, which is 23.7% of the couples, which is implying this kind of breadwinner homemaker model. Perhaps the wife is not working at all, or she's working
Right.
full time and working very little. And so I was surprised to see that huge chunk. But then the largest section does state husband and wife make within 5,000 of each other. And that's the largest. So we see this kind of duality happening in this chart. One of the mothers in the chapter mentioned that she wants to get out of the house just to go to her part-time pharmacy job, just to get a break from this child rearing responsibility and have some time to focus on herself, but in the workplace. And then she talked about the esteem that comes with working in the workplace.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
it boosted her self-esteem.
It's like I'm here, I'm professional, and people rely on something that I'm offering them, and that does give people a sense of purpose. And you have to let's be honest. People say, when I think of work, especially being raised in a blue collar home, like, to me, work was central to your identity.
Yeah.
That was number one, and everything else was secondary. But you had to have an occupation, you had to earn a living, and that was, like, for me, that was your intended purpose in life. And then if you retire and you happen to live a few years after retirement, well, there, you earned it. And I'm like, wow, that's what life really is. Life is work, and then you die.
Yeah. So they do talk about single parents on page 417, and they talked about some of the government programs that assisted, especially it was made for widowed women. And so considering that women were supported by their husbands, if a woman lost a husband, they thought that, the politicians thought that was a tragedy. And so the state was stepping into the role of the husband. And so it was really oriented around the widow person, and therefore these policies did not provide benefits to male single family formations, for example.
What that did was, in fact, solidify the idea of, if I'm a woman and I'm dependent on my husband, and if like, the idea, it actually supports that idea. It's like, I don't have to really worry, because if he dies, then I'll be taken care of. So I will submit to this structure. The other thing too that I didn't want to overlook was the role that gender socialization plays in perpetuating the idea that women and men have a significant division of labor.
Well, and also it's important to make the point that women and men both uphold these gender norms, and it's not just, one or the other. And
Right.
so
Absolutely.
women contribute to,
Absolutely.
perpetuating that men need to be the breadwinners, that men
Yeah.
need to pay for
Yeah.
the date, that the man needs to be in charge, do the yard work and all these expectations. And so women also have a responsibility to shift these dynamics as well.
There's an interesting thing that happens too when women are, they socialize into that, but they get an education, they become very successful on the job, and they make they're making good salary, all of that, which they've worked hard to earn, right? But they will only date a man who makes more than they make.
And then they want him to pay for the date and not
Yeah.
go
So
Dutch.
just because a woman is highly educated, successful in her occupation, does not mean that she has given up the gender, those gender socialization that's changed the perspective. It just doesn't just go away.
And there's studies on that too, because for women, the more educated and higher up on the ladder they become, then they are going to pick, from a smaller pool of men. And so
Yes.
then they enter the situation where there's not that many men available, because
Yeah.
they're not considering men who make less than them. But on the other hand, for men, who don't expect women to be bringing a lot of money to the table, perhaps, but just providing the domestic work and the
Yeah.
attractiveness,
Yeah.
then she can be a lot younger than him. She can make a lot less money, but she's making up for it in other ways, maybe being, a good looking object on his arm that he can show off, which also equals to his money and his status, because
Yeah.
obviously he's a pretty impressive man to
Yeah.
have such a beautiful woman on his arm that
Absolutely.
he's obviously paying for in one way or another.
Absolutely. And we
And
see that.
probably that, we think about that kind of trophy wife position. And so that stereotype that she's, a gold digger, whereas we don't expect her to be like a lawyer making twice the money that he's making.
Exactly. No, exactly. Well, I always find, and I'll only give two examples, like is Bill and Hillary Clinton, and Barack and Michelle Obama. Both, both partnerships is exemplary accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they operate in this patriarchal system, I believe that behind closed doors, it's real egalitarian.
Mm-hmm.
I
Well,
feel like,
I remember seeing about Michelle Obama in the documentary, I believe it was, about her life, where she talks about, they both have these law degrees, they met in the same office, and she was already working there. She was there
right,
before him, but
right,
then they got married, and then when they had the children, who was it that quit their job to stay at home raising children? And
yeah,
the chapter mentions that for women who are very highly educated, who are very elite, who have very high professional jobs, when they quit their job to take care of the children, it's a huge drop down the socioeconomic status ladder there.
and it's a huge disruption to their career trajectory.
Right.
And I think there's also this question for, let's say, for lack of a better term, progressive-minded people to say, well, why would this woman choose then to, you know what I'm saying? And that's when it comes down to, we still undervalue, though, the significance of raising children in the right way.
We would say, why would she choose to raise her own children when she could exploit another poorer woman to raise her children for her?
Exactly. And so I feel like there's that decision, like you just said right there. If no matter how accomplished you are, a woman may say, I refuse to exploit another woman so that I can, pursue my career. So that's a huge decision to make,
Maybe this
really
other woman, if she wasn't so busy, working as a nanny, she could have gone to school, got an education, and worked her way up the ladder, but she was just tracked at this nanny level. Well, on page 418, they have a section on the motherhood penalty. And so this is interesting because, yeah, we can understand that having children can take away from one's occupation, and so provide a penalty. But the thing is that this only affects women, because there's a motherhood penalty, but there's actually what do they call it? A fatherhood premium, they call it in the section. So when a woman says, "Oh, I have children," and this is an illegal question during a job interview, but sometimes, women talk about it. Maybe the employer saw them on Facebook with their children. So they know that the woman has children, and so they're thinking, the employer's thinking, well, how do we know this person's going to be very committed to the job? She might not show up to work and take the kid to the doctor.
Absolutely.
However, when a man is married and he has children, the employer thinks the opposite. The employer thinks, oh, this is an upstanding man, a solid family man. He obviously deserves to make even more money because he's taking care of a family. And he probably has a wife that's taking care of the kids. So he's really going to be committed to our job. So he gets a fatherhood premium.
Absolutely. I think that's well stated. It's a premium. He becomes elevated in his attractiveness as an employee, but also elevated in his moral compass. Kind of such in a way, if you were a king, but there was no one in your kingdom, you would be seen differently than a king who has a kingdom. I'm not sure how that plays out in terms of the number of children. If a man is a father to one children versus 5, if he has 5 children, might he even be more elevated on that premium? Whereas a woman has 5 children, it would be every child she has, the less attractive she becomes to an employer, and the greater responsibility she has for performing unpaid care work.
The chapter has a section on family leave, and I always think that this is a huge eye-opener for students to, think about how the U.S. compares to other countries, because it's quite dismal when you add up how the United States offers only unpaid leave.
I had no idea. Like when I saw this chart the first time, I just couldn't. And then I'm like, wow, this is an interesting South Korea and Japan. That was an interesting, cultural piece of information.
So the burden is really shared across society, and it, in the United States, the Congress passed the Family and Medical Leave Act in 1993, and I was struck by how relatively recent that is to us, perhaps not to our students, but that's fairly recent.
Very recent.
Consider that there wasn't perhaps something that good beforehand. And that also all the bill does, and it only applies to half of all workers because it has some restrictions to it. And it's for 12 weeks of unpaid leave.
Yeah.
Unpaid, which means simply that your boss can't fire you for having a baby. That's what our success is in America.
And obviously here we go with the idea of private industry not wanting to cut into their profits. Because while that time is unpaid, number one, they still have to cover the healthcare premiums as it relates to that act. But also, I looked up, and aside from the state of Montana, every state has at-will employment. And so you could return to your job, and you could be at will. Obviously, they don't want to do it while you're under this regulated act, but when you return, you found a replacement that's better than you, or something could happen. It's like almost like when you return to work, there's this level of uncertainty about your job that happens. And it was even depicted on the series, like Working Moms. That was like a predominant theme in the show. It's a comedic show in Canada, but there's the women, it really unveiled the idea of like when a woman comes back to work or takes part-time work, her role in the firm or the organization or the company is significantly diminished.
Which you're implying by stating that they could kind of retaliate after the woman returns to work by then firing her, because they might anticipate that motherhood penalty
Yeah.
situation of perhaps now she's going to be taking the baby to the doctor all the time.
And I also think the other thing kind of in at the micro level of how these, how these larger institutional problems manifest themselves is, let's say a woman does return to work after maternity leave and she is given unfulfilling work that is below her abilities. And if you've ever had a job that you work that is excruciatingly painful to do, and there's companies that can really put you in a position where you want to quit as opposed to being fired. So that's one of the best ways to get rid of a person is to make their work life miserable.
They mentioned some issues that could help balance this family life situation. And so one of them talks about how a lot of younger folks are delaying marriages. And so this reduces their housework burden. A lot of couples are delaying their having children till later on in their career, when they're a bit more settled.
Mm-hmm. But those are all individual decisions that people make.
Right.
And, most people, I don't know if it's most, but I would assume that most people have great pressure from family
Right.
or society to reach these certain milestones.
Yeah.
In my class, I asked students the question of what do they believe is the best time for people to get married.
Yeah.
And in my anticipation is you could never establish the best time because it's different for each person. And it could be never, right? But that was never mentioned. It was always in the mid-20s when, and from my standpoint, it's like, wow, that is really early to be married, because once usually marriage happens, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but, from my experiences, within a year or two, that's when the children start to come if they've decided to have children. And so marriage is kind of kicks off, the rest of your life. And to do that at such what I would say a young age, it's almost like being pressured to do something before you're cognitively able to really figure out what you're actually doing.
You're right.
And then it's
it just happens to you.
Right.
They quote this page, like we discussed on whether people discuss, if they want children, when they want children, do they discuss with their partner about their future expectations of who's going to do this child rearing and so on. They quoted a Pew Research Center survey where they talked about how women would prefer not to have to work full time and would actually prefer to be able to work part time, probably assuming that they could meet, their obligations.
Right.
And assuming this is based on another gender normative kind of perspective that women are valuing perhaps more of their time spent with their children and their family. But it was interesting to note in the same survey that 3/4 of fathers think a full-time job is ideal for them. So men's expectations of wanting to work for part-time have not changed.
Speaking from the point of view of a cisgendered man, that has always been the top of like an identity of what manhood is. One could say manhood is protection and things like that, but to me, it's like it is being a provider. Even if it's providing for yourself. I mean, that's, a lot of work as it is to provide for yourself.
Not dependent on someone.
And I would say from a social perspective, even more pressure for men because women have that, the whole child rearing, the childbirth, women have the children. I always say, like, if either men or women or just men could have children, things would be shifted so differently, so our society is rooted in that biological differentiation and what that means, in perpetuating society.
Yeah. They mentioned on page 425 just that when a father does stay at home, it's usually because he's lost his job and it wasn't quite a choice. He didn't choose to give up a high paying job to stay home with the children, but he lost his job. And therefore now it makes economic sense for the woman to continue working. And they have him at home saving them $15,000 a year in childcare expenses.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense, but probably he's concerned about his masculinity and how his neighbors and friends are judging him.
About his masculinity, but again, like we talked about earlier, the power differential shifts significantly.
Yes.
And, it's one thing to have an equalitarian relationship, which I believe is important shift for all of society. But then if we shift from men having the power differential because of income, and then women having that, I feel like there would be a significant response to that if it started to happen.
There was a section in that previous chart, 11.7, where they had maybe it's, I don't know, 15% total, I think, of women who are earning more than men. And they broke it down, 5 to 10,000 more, 10 to 30,000 more, 30 to 50,000 more, and wife earns 50,000 more, still 5.1%. And so imagine the different power dynamics within those households. Then does that really shift? And how do the larger gender expectations maintain those gendered expectations when the woman is making so much more than the man?
I feel that would play out in more ways than just economics. It would play out in interpersonal dynamics.
Yes.
It would play out in.
Sometimes men lash out in those situations.
Absolutely.
They're feeling, emasculated, and so they start to attack that person, or perhaps that's when the man cheats on his wife, or becomes abusive, or becomes angry and strained.
All that, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think
with celebrities sometimes, when the woman, Halle Berry, becomes very successful, the man kind of exerts, a backlash.
The Academy Awards. I was on the top of the world. Career accomplishment. I had a wonderful husband, beautiful daughter. I thought this must be what having it all is. And I'm 35 and I got it, And then 10 days after that, this article comes out.
And the article said
that Eric was having an affair with a woman of his past. I didn't even ask him if it were true. I said, I'm going to sue this magazine. I have had it. I'm going to spend all my money. I'm going to own Star Magazine. I was done. I was done. I never even asked him the question if it were true. I just got into sue mode. And about a week later, he finally saw that I was in sue mode, and he said, I need to tell you something. And that article is true.
That article is true.
And it's heartbreaking, because I had a perfect marriage. I mean, this is one of the kindest men I think I've ever known on many levels.
And I saw you all together, and I was like, whatever that is, I want some of that.
There's definitely going to be backlashes for women much more than men, especially because of the constant disruption that happens when you have children in the home all day. And there's, obviously, in order to get certain work done, it needs focused time. And it'd be interesting to see if there is, heterosexual married couples, and they did have an extra room. They're both working at home and the children are there. I would probably think that men would probably get the private room before the woman. Kind of in conclusion of the chapter, it is not just a moral dilemma, it is a moral dilemma, but that's not it. It's a moral dilemma. It's an economic dilemma. It's every aspect of modern society is impacted by the relationship between families and work.
Right.
And you don't see it going away anytime soon, unless companies that employ people take progressive steps towards solving the problem and allow government, force government to follow. as opposed to the other way around.
So that's quite a real challenge for our society, for the companies, and for the future.
Absolutely, it's a challenge, but ultimately, it's just like one of those things. Being a sociologist, and all you see is problems that are just never solved, and there's thinkers. There's thinkers in all disciplines that can contribute to the solutions.
Right.
But it's kind of like a system that just does not want to bend, and it continues to replicate itself, much like the richest people in society. That replication is happening at the institutional level, and it's unabated. It's a logjam.
I think it's important just for our students to really kind of think about these things deeply and talk to their partners and future partners about the division of labor and just how they can really work towards achieving these objectives, so that everyone has a chance to have a fulfilling career, have their chosen types of family formation, and so on.
And feel empowered to advocate for these things that are moralistically possible, that are economically possible.
Right.
And not put yourself in a position where you feel powerless, especially before it all happens.
Right.
Think about it. Like, you would not go on vacation without kind of planning where you're going to go, where you're going to stay, what you're going to bring. But we jump into the families and the work world, and then we try to figure out after we're there. So this is a good time to really think about what that trajectory could possibly look like in your home. And then if it's your home and their home and their home and their home, ultimately it will start to reproduce itself, and we will see huge social change. I know that's very idealistic, but I am an idealist.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today in our discussion of chapter 11, Work and Families.
Work and Family.